Well, hello everybody. Welcome to today's session where we're going to be talking about protecting IBM I and the Power System server from cyber attacks. We're going to give you 10 different ways that you can look at your security and hopefully improve your stance, and begin doing that as soon as you're done with the session today. Our agenda is pretty brief. We're going to do a quick introduction so you know a little bit more about who is presenting to you today, and then I'm going to jump into, first of all, why our server and perhaps privileged accounts are under attack, as well as then include some of the statistics specific to IBM I. We're going to focus, of course, most of our attention today on 10 ways that you can protect the system from those types of cyber attacks and some improvements that you can start making immediately. We have got some time at the end for questions and answers. If you do have a question, feel free to pose that through the chat window. If you don't see the chat window, just click the little speech bubble up in the top right-hand side of your WebEx window, and that should open that panel up for you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robin Tatum. I am the Director of Security Technologies here at Health Systems, and that really simply means that I am the evangelist of the security message. So I talk to a lot of user groups. I'm one of the subject matter experts for Common, and I'm also a certified security manager. So I do deep dive audits and security engagements for customers, but certainly a big fan of the platform. I've been on the box now for an unbelievable 26 years. And so certainly feel free to ask any questions that you have pertaining to security on IBM I, not necessarily just on the content we're covering today, and I'd be happy to try and answer those for you. PowerTech's the leading provider of security solutions for IBM I, so this allows us to develop a very close relationship with a lot of different customers across different countries around the globe. We have organizations that are in pretty much every industry vertical out there, and we've been a part of Health Systems now since 2008. We have relationships, of course, with IBM as well as with PCI, the Security Standards Council, who are the folks that handle all of the credit card processing, or at least the rules. We're also authorized by the National Association State Board of Accountancy, bit of a mouthful there, in order to issue continuing professional education credits to auditors for security education on IBM I. Lastly, and perhaps most pertinent here today, we're also the publisher of the annual State of IBM I Security Study, which is one of the sources of information that we use to pull insight for how IBM I is configured and perhaps some of the areas that it's most lacking, and hopefully you can use that information to improve. That is a free white paper. We'll be working on the 2016 study here probably in the next 30 days or so, but for now, the 2015 study is available for free download from our website. As part of our market leadership, we do have a number of modules that are designed to help address IBM I security and compliance challenges that you may be struggling with. And now, while there's integration between a lot of these modules, all of these solutions can be used independent of one another depending on what your particular requirements are. Now, you will get a copy of this recording and a copy of the slide deck after the session is complete, so you can review this in your own time. So let's talk about whether services are being targeted. And the answer is yes. But that's probably not a surprise, certainly to anyone who knows that that's where most of the corporate data resides, that valuable information. Now, what's interesting is that even though organizations have known that servers are targets for a number of years, they've had time to improve security, but at least in the IBM I space, it doesn't appear that we've made much difference. You know, there's growth in server breaches across the board here, and these slides are from a very popular study conducted by Verizon that indicates that servers continue to be the primary focus of most data breaches and hacks. The other thing to note is that espionage is a growing threat motivator, which is interesting. I think many of us struggle to understand what it would make to really create them as a target for perhaps a foreign government or, you know, other entity. And so we consequently dismiss really the viability of that type of threat. But really that's a mistake, because in today's world, data is a valuable commodity no matter what, whether it's financial information, intellectual property, or even customer data. Another area that we see is privileged users being the target of different types of attack. And again, this is another area where it seems that perhaps foreign governments are actively starting to target IT staff. Now, of course, this is not all about, Hollywood-style recruitment here. There's certainly a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to either internal employees as well as people who are trying to use information from one system or one data breach to leverage against another organization, perhaps determining that users have a tendency to use the same credentials wherever they are. Now, the good news here is, of course, that the vast majority of IT staff are going to be honest, hardworking people. But what about perhaps temporary staff or contractors or consultants, which we allow into our business on perhaps a temporary basis? How do we ensure that these people are not a threat? Now, this to me is quite an interesting slide here, because really privileged users alludes to the possibility that there could be servers that are susceptible to those within the organization, targeting them to obtain their access rights. Honestly, who hasn't shared their access credentials with an IT colleague some point in time? Who would be susceptible perhaps to providing those credentials if the credentials of a work employee that they knew appeared not to work? Maybe they lent those credentials so that they could get on and do something urgently. Perhaps you wouldn't, but you know for sure that somebody else would do those types of things. We might not expect a normal employee to be able to gain access rights, but an IT administrator that logs on to a normal employee's machine sometimes leaves an administrative footprint that could be exploited. One could also assume that social engineers from outside of the organization wouldn't be able to obtain access rights, but social engineers are very skillful at what they do. If you've ever seen videos or clips of people that are actually very skilled in this area, it's quite eye-opening how they're able to manipulate people that they're speaking with, perhaps leveraging our propensity to trust somebody that we feel is in a position of authority, or perhaps an IT help desk, etc. Now, I think many of us in the IT world roll our eyes and look at that and say, I would never fall for that. But I think the reality is that the skill and the complexity of those types of attacks is continuing to increase. The emails that come out now can exactly mirror the perhaps host organization that they're faking out, or the calls that come in are coming from people that have at least basic information about us that they've perhaps extrapolated from another server or from a social network. In many cases, there's going to be multiple facets to an attack. An attack doesn't necessarily initially target a privileged user directly, and maybe even bypasses them directly to get at that server. Now, these attacks can be complex, and they can also be very subtle, and privileged users may not have a clue as to what's actually happening. Research has shown that about 80% of the time, it's external parties that discover that an attack has actually occurred, and often this is going to be months after the incident actually took place. So the point is that noticing and stopping an email with malware directed towards a privileged user isn't what organizations shouldn't really be overly concerned about, because the privileged user is more likely to be aware of the threat. It's the attacks that use multiple stages and methods that go after those privileged accounts in a more roundabout way, which is going to be more of a concern. I think one of the things that we've all heard over the years is IBM is very strong, very secure, and really we don't have to do a whole lot in order to protect this system environment. So why do we even talk about security on this platform then? Well, the reality is that we have a lot of insight into IBM security. We've been publishing that State of IBM Security report now since 2004. Last year we did over 110 different audits of systems that we included within the study, and we hit on many different areas of review, including auditing, those privileged users that I mentioned, password rules, system values, even virus scanning. One of the things that we've determined from this report is that IBM is a very securable server, but that doesn't necessarily equate to people actually taking the necessary steps in order to secure it. The report consistently sees the same key areas of concern. For example, Not all of the exit points that allow us to monitor network connections have any types of exit programs in place. We have overly privileged users. A lot of times people are carrying root level access with all object special authority. We see that a lot of the systems are not meeting basic best practices, let alone some of the more advanced ones like PCI. For example, PCI requires a password length to be at least 7 characters, but surprisingly, we still see systems that are in the 1, 2, and 3 character length realm in order for, hopefully, the user to get on more easily, but missing the mark from the standpoint of these systems are easy to breach when we can simply guess 26 times and perhaps be signed on to the system. One of the things that we look at within the study is the number of failed login attempts and how many organizations don't restrict that type of access. Earlier this year, I had a system where one of the profiles on the machine had experienced more than 16 million invalid sign-on attempts. The reality is that these types of things can and should be logged, but if we're not looking at that log information, then we're not necessarily even going to see this. Now, in that particular example, the customer that I was having that conversation with was completely unaware that this type of action had been taking place. Now, it's quite possible that it's a service account or an application that's knocking on the door that many times, but at the end of the day, the customer had no idea who that profile was, and we had to actually go look and identify it. The concern for me wasn't, in fact, the number 16 million, although that was certainly quite jarring. The concern for me was more that there was lack of awareness that this activity was even happening on the system. So let's jump into some of the ways that we can improve IBM I security. First of all, we want to make sure that we are auditing the events that are happening on the system. Now, the IBM I operating system has a built-in auditing function. It's a great way to record the events that are happening into a tamper-proof repository. Interestingly, the OS does not have this enabled by default. It's a process you have to activate. Fortunately, there's lots of commands that make that very simple. And like most operating systems, this repository, like I said, is tamper-proof. It's called QAudJourn. And one of the requirements of most regulatory mandates is that audit entries go somewhere where the other users are not able to then go in and remove entries or modify those entries. In that light, PCI requires that events be moved off the system as quickly as possible. And the mindset there is, if we get it off of the source system, then the user who created the event in the first place isn't able to access that. Fortunately for us, like I said, we don't have such a concern. But in order to comply with those mandates, sometimes we still have to adhere to those rules. Now, the repository itself could be deleted if you're a security officer or have all object special authority, but the first event we would see in the new repository is that somebody deleted the last repository, and of course that would be grounds for action. One of the things that you need to do is establish some basic security around the repository. By default, all of the log entries are placed into the QGPL library. Most of us really try to avoid placing things in that library for fear they're going to get blended or confused with operating system objects. So what I recommend is that you place those objects into a standalone library, create that library, and maintain the configuration through that. Outside of that basic function, this is a great repository. It satisfies all of the regulatory requirements that says data has to be stored in a secure manner in a tamper-proof repository. Now, I did include here a command, change secaud, that allows you to perform all of the necessary steps in order to create and manage this repository. Change secaud will allow you to configure the two primary system values that control this, as well as create the first initial receiver. Now, in my case here, I'm creating this initial receiver in a library called Audit lib. You can certainly create anything you want to put that receiver in, but wherever you create that first receiver, the subsequent receivers are going to be created as well. If you'd like more information on the initial setup and configuration of the system auditing function, we do have a white paper called Auditing in the Real World that is, of course, available at no charge. You're welcome to download that, read through it. And if you have any questions about setting up the auditing function, let us know and we'll be happy to help you. Now, the controls that you apply really are not something that you can just set and forget. You don't want to set this up and then revisit it a year later. there's really got to be a constant review of the system. And most regulatory mandates speak to the fact that the initiative involves constantly monitoring your system. The reason for that is when an event happens on your server, you don't want me to be the one finding it 3 months later when I do an audit of your environment, or perhaps when your auditor comes in 12 months later. Now, there's a constant review, and we need to make adjustments as we go. Maybe we have a baseline policy that we utilize to measure whether our system is compliant with how we expect it to be configured, but there really are different types of reports that we need to be looking at. We want to take a view of system auditing. Are we looking at the correct security events that are happening? And do we need to send notifications out if this type of thing is happening? Certainly having the system proactively monitor itself is a great way of offsetting perhaps the volume of events that would otherwise have to be checked manually. We want to look at things like privileged users. Who has the power over this system? And perhaps the database, bearing in mind that users are only granted one user ID and password, and that gives them access not only to sign on to the machine, but also to connect to the database, to run SQL statements, and maybe even to do administrative tasks. They use those same credentials to log into network services like FTP and DDM. So we want to make sure that when a user is given credentials that we've established the correct controls, they've been given the right levels of access, and we monitor their activity on the system. We want to take a close look at the password and user configuration. We want to check that frequently to make sure that things are not being changed without our knowledge, or without at least validating that that was a general requirement. You'd be surprised how many times we have done a security scan of a customer system, and the customer has expressed that they know how this thing is configured, only to find they're very surprised when perhaps the password expiration interval has been turned off, or the password minimum length has been changed from what they believed was maybe 7 or 8 characters down to a much shorter length. And because they're confident in those procedures, they don't ever go back and double check that the system is still set correctly. We want to talk about data access. Now, data access pertains, of course, to the access levels that users have to the database. Now, in the old days when it was all green screen applications, it was fairly easy to control user access through menus and perhaps whether they have access to a command line. We rely on application vendors to correctly configure their applications, but you'd be surprised how often application vendors leave the public authority, for example, to their application database wide open. They really infer that it's the end customer's responsibility to configure security in a manner that meets their corporate goals. Unfortunately, this means that everybody's looking to another entity to take control of this. And what invariably happens then is we find that security falls upon the server's defaults. And IBM actually ships the IBM I operating system with public authority defaults at start change. And start change is enough to be able to read, modify, and even delete data in a file. So if these vendors just load their applications, or you create your own applications, and you don't take any additional steps to secure those objects, you'll find that everybody who has a user ID is going to have access, full access to that application information. The network access side of things has come about since, of course, the advent of the green screen. And back in the mid-90s, IBM TCP enabled the server, which gave us a lot of really great functionality like FTP and ODBC connections into the database. The problem is the fact that we had previously relied on simple things like menus and application security suddenly meant now that our security layer was transparent, because FTP doesn't display a menu, and ODBC doesn't go through the application itself. So in essence now, we are exploiting, if you will, as a user community, the amount of access that we've been granted over the years. So we need to make sure that these types of connections are both monitored and controlled. And lastly, system security values. Most of our configuration in the IBM I world is done through these entities called system values. And it's important that we check these on an ongoing basis to make sure that they do meet the requirements that we have. We want to have some type of baseline built so that we have a comparison. We have the ability to do some baseline checking of how our system looks today versus what we expect it to look like, and then we can address any discrepancies. Sometimes that means that the policy needs to be updated. Perhaps some technology has been introduced into the environment that was not there when this baseline was originally built. So don't oversee the fact that potentially the baseline will be updated. But more often than not, we find that the server simply has been changed by somebody who was not familiar with the process, didn't realize there was a baseline, or somebody made a change with the expectation that it would be temporary, and they didn't change it back when they were done. All right, number 3, monitor network access. Now, to me, network access is probably one of the biggest vulnerabilities for any IBM I server. Certainly, object-level security is going to protect your system from any type of access, regardless of where it comes from. But, as I've expressed, most people don't implement object-level security. And so for that reason, knowing when people are using those given credentials to come in through interfaces that perhaps are not the anticipated connection methodology is absolutely critical. We find that end users got a lot of access to the database, that we're reliant on legacy controls like menus and command line restrictions. And all of a sudden, the users that have now PCs on their desks instead of dumb terminals are able to utilize Windows to come in through NetServer and Telnet and FTP and these interfaces. And they're not that hard to configure. It used to be you had to have a degree in rocket science to be able to configure ODBC, but nowadays when you install client access and you have Microsoft Excel on your PC, it adds menu items for you that says download data from IBM I. 2 or 3 clicks, the data's into a spreadsheet. Now, that's great if that is an anticipated activity, but certainly I think most of us don't have an open database policy that says you can download it from any file that you want, maybe throw it on a thumb drive and walk out of the door. As an additional concern, some services, for example, DDM, does not honor the flag in a user's profile that indicates whether that user is allowed to run commands or not. So it's called limited capabilities. And from a green screen perspective, it's very effective, but some other interfaces don't respect this setting. So we want to make sure that users who are not being given or granted permission to run commands, that they can't simply go in and run them through another interface. The reality is that these interfaces are going to continue to grow. We are seeing more and more applications that are leveraging network-type connections versus pure green screen applications. And unfortunately, in violation of pretty much every regulatory mandate on the book, there is no record of this type of activity taking place. Now granted, if a user tries to access a file that they don't have permission to, it will absolutely generate an authority failure, assuming you have auditing configured correctly. However, data transfer is not an auditable event. So even if you have all the auditing turned on, at best you will see that they opened a file, not necessarily that they downloaded it into a spreadsheet and walked out the door. There's 4 major categories of exit points for this type of access. We have the original PCS servers, we have DDM and DRDA servers, we have what's called optimized client access servers, and that's where most of us are living in addition to the TCP IP services. The commands I have at the end there, the work reg INF will take you into the system registry. Be careful if you do go in there. It's simply the registration point where an exit point that IBM provides is told whether there is an exit program overseeing its activities. There's more than 30 servers that pertain to network access, so this is definitely an area that you want to look into. That gives us more than 170 servers and sub-functions that can be monitored in order to regulate and control that network access. The expectation from IBM is that you can certainly write and maintain your own exit programs, but you will also want to consider purchasing a commercial software package in order to do this. It simplifies the process. Some of the exit programs, if all you want to do is say, I don't want any traffic coming through, certainly very easy to write. But for most of us, it's not a blanket denial. We want certain users to be able to download certain things at certain times. And so using a commercial-grade exit program allows you to leverage the expertise that a company like PowerTech, for example, has brought into this space. The good news here is one of the biggest vulnerabilities, it's also one of the easiest items to fix. And for most people, this is typically close to the top of the list for items to be addressed. Number 4, let's extend that a little bit further. Not only do we want to be able to have visibility to those connections, that's certainly the first thing, but we can also use those network exit programs to control the amount of access that's happening. Now, those exit points are looking for the exit program to tell them if the transaction is valid or not. In other words, the exit program, when invoked, is going to be given information about the user and where they're coming from and what they're asking to do. That exit program then can chew over that information and make a determination based on how it's programmed as to whether that transaction should be allowed to continue. If so, then when the exit program ends, it simply passes back a pass-fail indicator to the exit point, which will tell the exit point whether the transaction should be shut down or whether it should be passed over to the operating system in order to be performed. Lots of things we can do here, upload versus download, certain object versus another object. And we can even write code within that exit program that allows us to temporarily override the amount of permission a user has. So if you struggle with too many privileged users on your system, just be aware that before you have to re-architect that whole thing, which can be very time-consuming and extensive, there are some things we can do to temporarily downgrade a user's privileges as well as upgrade them. Number 5, this is an important step and something that gets frequently overlooked, but we need to understand who our privileged users are. Now, on most servers, we have hundreds, often thousands of profiles that are designed to indicate to the operating system where this user can do, where they can go, and what their capabilities are. Now, a lot of that's handled through what we call special authorities. There's 8 of them. They're administrative privileges, and they are granted to IBM users like they are going out of fashion. We will see sometimes upwards of 90% of the users on a particular server running with full administrator privileges. Quite staggering. Now, we want to look at that with a sense of reasonableness. Is the user able to exploit those privileges? And so there are other things that we look at, including their ability to run commands. Of course, if they don't have an exit point program monitoring network connections, it's possible they could always run a command that way, but part of this is understanding when one function influences another. But certainly limit capabilities is an important aspect, something we want to understand how many users have that type of privilege, because it would allow them to enter directly CL commands that perhaps may bring the system down to a restricted state or would allow them to delete a production library. We want to look at profiles that haven't been on the system for a long time, because we're trying to determine if there are profiles that need to be cleaned up. In a perfect world, we will remove those profiles, although certainly at least disabling them is the first step. Any change that you make to a profile, if you are auditing, is going to generate what we call a CP entry, and that's going to give us information about which profile was changed or created and the type of attributes that it was given. Now, if you're running on a newer version of the operating system, say version 7.2, there was some extra information added to those CP entries to tell you kind of the before and after on a profile change. So now it's a little clearer with regards to what was actually modified when a profile goes through a change event. Starting with a list of the profiles on your system is a good start. We want to make sure that that we understand what those profiles are, how long they've been there, and like I said, start digging into what type of privileges they have. Now, one of the things that we deal with is really a two-phase process of privileged users. First phase is removing privileges from users that just have no reason to have those privileges. You know, we've got an end user in the warehouse running with all object special authority, which in theory would allow them to delete any database object or even the operating system itself. There's no reason for that, and it simply needs to be removed, of course, done carefully and with testing. The second phase of this, then, is to determine which users have at least an occasional requirement for some type of privileged access. Maybe it's a programmer who needs to sign on to our production partition and fix a problem that's occurred in the application, or an administrator who needs to do some type of housekeeping function on the weekend. Once we determine who these true privileged users are, we want to consider giving them these privileges on an as-needed basis. If give a look at any of the regulatory mandates, most of them have some type of disclaimer in there that allows for access by a privileged user as long as we are overseeing their actions and we are giving them those privileges only for as long as they need them. There are functions that we have within our software portfolio that make this easier. Without that type of function, a lot of times we see a secondary profile being created, perhaps an emergency account. While that certainly does work, it doesn't necessarily solve the issue of visibility as to what the user is doing. And so the software solution typically is a better approach because it allows us to create a much easier to read breadcrumb trail of where the user went. Number 7, review your system values. I mentioned that there's more than 170 different system values now in the operating system. These are categorized and can be printed. So one of the things that you need to do at an absolute minimum is to print this list off. Understand what each of those system values does and what it controls. You can Google the system value name to find more information. Once you have that baseline developed, once you understand what each of those system values does and what it needs to be set to, then on an ongoing basis, you need to check to make sure it's not changing. Now, one of the easiest ways to do this is looking for the SV entries inside that repository, the audit journal. An SV entry will be generated any time a system value is changed. Baseline comparison is also valuable here, looking down that list and saying, is this set the way I expect? But understand with baseline comparison, there is possibility that if you don't check it very frequently, that the value changed and then changed back to its correct value. And only for a temporary time was it set incorrectly. So for me, it's a joint effort between doing a baseline comparison, which we can make the system do itself, as well as monitoring then for those SV entries that may come along. If you're interested, you can also lock down a number of system values through system service tools. As part of SST, there is an option in there to lock system values. Now, it's not all system values, but it's certainly a good subset. I generally like this feature. Being able to prevent even a security officer from simply changing a system value is beneficial because it means that nobody can load a program onto my system that does it also. And changing a system value is usually something that we want to have careful planning of. Now, we're generating a lot of information here. Certainly the audit journal is a primary source of this, and collecting that information is by far the most important step. I use the analogy of a closed-circuit TV in a bank. Admittedly, we're probably not sitting there watching that camera feed 24/7. But if somebody comes in and robs the bank, the first thing we're going to need to do is extract that tape, rewind it, and review it. Same thing in the IBMI world. If you're not auditing, even if you're not looking at that information, if you're not auditing that data, then there's no way to rewind it. It doesn't matter what software you load, no matter what queries you write, you will not be able to recreate that log. So collecting the information is by far the most critical step. And that's the good news. That part is totally free. It takes one command to configure it, and outside of some perhaps DASD usage, disk usage, there's really no impact on your system. Now, the second part to this, where the real value comes in, is actually looking this information. Now, there's two primary sources of reports that we want to look at. One is what I call event or activity reports. These are usually things that are created on a daily basis, and these are usually the event things that are coming from that audit journal report. We also have compliance reports, which, depending on the report, perhaps are going to be produced less frequently. We're going to be looking at things like system values and privileged users and profiles with default passwords, things like that. Shouldn't necessarily be happening every day, but certainly we want to look at it at least perhaps on a weekly or monthly basis. So inside the presentation, again, I'll get you a copy of this, we've included some suggestions with regards to the types of events that we would recommend that people take a look at. Now, this isn't a one-size-fits-all. Certainly it can be added and removed from to suit your requirements, but we wanted to give a pretty comprehensive view of the types of things that you should be looking at or at least have visibility to within your environment. Here's an example of some of the compliance reports that perhaps you or even your auditor would like to produce. Having this done on a scheduled basis makes it a lot easier. I know for one, I would not want to sit here and manually generate these reports and look at them, even if it was only weekly or monthly. I'd rather have the system generate that information for me, and that's where some of the tooling comes in and provides benefit, is that it will handle all of this and serve the information up to me even through email. So my responsibility really is simply to review that information and, of course, act on it if something unusual is seen. Many customers really have never talked about or considered any type of antivirus for their IBM environment. We do see some that use a PC-type scanning system, which introduces some other inherent problems in terms of security with regards to reliability and performance. But understand that viruses can impact your IBM server. Now, typically we talk about the system being virus resistant. Most of us, I think, have heard from IBM or other sources, perhaps, that you're not going to get a virus in the native IBM world. But certainly there's an asterisk, a disclaimer at the end of that, which talks about the integrated file system. This is something that's been in the operating system since version 3, so a long, long time ago. And it is a PC-type structure. So it can house your Word docs, your PDF files, MP3s, you name it. If you can drag and drop it in Windows, it can live in the integrated file system. Now, the more prevalent use of the integrated file system over recent years has meant that we have seen a dramatic upswing in the number of servers that have risk and vulnerability associated with viruses. Now, the good news is IBM recognized this. They antivirus-enabled the operating system. What does that mean? Well, in essence, they determined that it was possible to get a virus in the integrated file system, and so they added controls that would, in essence, invoke a scan engine if it were to be present. Now, the scan engine is something that you have to purchase. Help Systems does actually have a commercial-grade scan engine that runs natively in IBM I. But once loaded, the operating system comes alive. It knows that that engine exists. It will scan objects prior to being opened. If it does determine that an object is infected and it can't be cleansed for some reason, the operating system actually steps in and quarantines that object, preventing even a security officer from accessing it. This gives us the benefit of preventing the IBM I from being a host that's spreading viruses to other servers and clients on the network. Now, traditionally, I would always tell people, yep, it won't infect the native world. The traditional RPG programs, CL programs, physical files are not going to be infected, and that still is true today. However, I've amended my comments a little bit because we did have a customer about a year and a half ago who did contract a virus in their integrated file system, and because of the way they had their file shares set up, they were actually sharing out their root folder. And under the root folder of the IFS is everything native. QSys.lib drills you into, first of all, the operating system, and then gives you access to all of your native application objects. Now, in this case, the particular virus that was running was, every time the file that was infected was opened, it was renaming another file, get it out of the way, and then it was putting itself in place of that original object. In other words, it was hopping around. And for this particular customer, they were just very lucky that the virus didn't reach in to the QSys.lib structure, bearing in mind that it will run with the privileges of the user that opened the infected file, and either delete or rename or move an object that would have caused havoc with either the operating system or the object, the application itself. So we want to make sure that we are not the weakest link here. So as PCI states, you have to have antivirus on every server that is in scope. So we want to leverage the controls that IBM has built into the operating system, and we want to make sure that the virus engine is commercial grade so that the DAT signatures are coming from, in our case, from Intel Security as part of a McAfee enterprise engine, and that you keep on top of those updates. When you do that, you'll find that the system is not only protecting itself, but it's also ensuring that it doesn't act as a host to every other device on the network. Okay, number 10 here, run a security scan. Now, this to me is probably the first step for most people. And what I'm really talking about here is an audit or an assessment of your environment. Now, the good news here is that we have a scan function that we can run. Typically runs in only a couple minutes, and it doesn't cost a penny for you to use. Now, the benefit of this is it's giving you the opportunity to get insight into how your system is configured. Because let's face it, many of us really don't know. We've inherited this system from the administrator before who inherited it from the administrator before them. And while one of the big benefits of the IBM I environment is this ability to simply migrate from one generation of the system to the next, which is great if you're a system admin, it's not so great if you're a security officer, because what we're doing is bringing forward the same configuration mindset that we had in 1992 into a system that is now running in 2015, 2016, and where we have a whole different mindset when it comes to risk, security, and compliance. Having a security scan done is a great starting point. It gives you a list of objectives that you need to mitigate in order to improve not only your security, but also potentially help you achieve compliance if a regular mandate is what's giving you the incentive to do something here. So the security scan tool that we have is not part of our commercial portfolio. This is simply designed specifically for this task. It gives you reports over many of the configuration settings that we look at within the state of IBM I security, and I've listed a few of them here. It doesn't cost you anything, like I said. You simply run the tool from your network, so nobody's accessing your system. It doesn't make any changes. It doesn't access any application data. And when you're done, it gives you a report that is yours to keep. Like I said, a great starting point. If you don't have a desire for this, but you have an auditor perhaps, hopefully they're familiar with the IBM I platform, that seems to be the bigger issue, then make sure that you're getting an assessment that includes your IBM I server and that you have a good understanding of how your profiles are configured and how your applications are set up for their authorities so that you're not addressing one or two things here and there without realizing that the barn door is open around the corner. If you're interested in doing a deeper dive than perhaps just a high-level scan, then PowerTech and Help Systems does have a number of deep dive offerings that allow us to actually get very far into the weeds and understand exactly how your server is configured. And these types of audits are done by people that are certified auditors and have been experienced and on the platform for many, many years. So very aware of the intricacies of the IBM I environment. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions, and feel free to use the chat window to post any of those. I know several of you did ask about where you can find the presentation or can you get a copy of the presentation. And what we'll do is send out an email as follow-up to this conclusion of this meeting. Usually it goes out within a day or two, so you should have that. We'll give you a link to the recording that I'm making as well as a copy of the slide deck. So you're welcome to share that with anybody in your organization if you think that information would be of use to them. Now, while people are posting questions here, I'm going to post up just one final slide that talks about some of the things that you can find on the Help Systems PowerTech website. Just as clarification, PowerTech is really the security division of Help Systems from a product perspective. We also have Skyview Partners, which is another aspect of Help Systems, which is more the service-oriented functionality. So penetration testing, deep dive assessments are all things that we can now do under the Skyview name as well. All right. But if you're looking for information on products, if you want any of the white papers that I've talked about, all of these things are available at helpsystems.com/PowerTech. Just make sure you put the www up there because otherwise it'll give you a page not found. But certainly once you get there, let us know if there's anything else we can do to help you. All right, somebody asking here, how does the free scan work and do you have to download software? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a quick poll here. It's just a 3-question poll. Let me go ahead and do that while I'm talking. And really the way the scan works is it's a piece of software that is downloaded from our website. We give you a link to that. The software loads on your PC like any Windows application. And when you run it, it connects to your IBM I server and will assess those 6, 7 different categories of information. Typically, it takes about 2 minutes to run, depending on the speed of your system. And when it finishes, it returns that information back to you directly in a browser. So you get that information response directly. There's no footprint left behind on the IBM I server, and we don't change anything. Of course, we're not coming in and manipulating security or accessing any data. Our goal is to help you make your security better. We're not looking to load anything that's going to make it worse. So we do have a lot of customers that run it in the middle of the day on production systems. I've never had anybody have any issue with that. The data that comes back is in a little tiny XML file, and that is what's interpreted and displayed to you in the browser. You do have the option of sharing that with us. It is anonymous and generic, and what we do with that information is actually aggregate them all together, and then that's what makes up our IBM I State of Security study. And you do have the option of not including your data in that, or we can show you what the data looks like before you decide if you want to include it or not. So there's no obligation. We want you to get visibility of your security environment when you do this so that you can start making improvements in how security looks on your box. Right. Once the tool is no longer needed, you can just uninstall it through normal Windows control panel, add remove programs. Now we leave it on the PC because we give you a 7-day grace period to run the software as many times as you want. So if you have more than one system or more than one partition, you're welcome to take advantage of it against every system or partition you have for that 7-day window. After the 7 days expires, you can't run any new collections, but you can always open up the assessments that you've run previously. So those are yours to keep. All right. Hopefully that gives you the background information there, and we can certainly provide more info if you're interested in doing that. Also asking, is there a way to audit DMLs and DDMs, SQL statements for when someone runs an update, delete, insert? Certainly SQLs and markup languages are probably the biggest concern I think a lot of us have, because they allow us to do mass changes to the database or even mass extractions without really generating much of a log. The IBM I operating system has an SQL environment in it. You just type start SQL and every user has permission to run that command. So we typically recommend that that be changed initially. But once they get into that environment, even the pretty comprehensive auditing in the operating system is not able to see those SQL statements because they're not CL commands. They're not being issued in a way that the operating system can audit. Now, in our shop, what we do is we enforce privilege escalation requirements. So if a user needs to go into SQL, for example, we have them use a tool that elevates their privileges to do so. And that tool actually includes a screen cam function that allows us to track users going into interactive SQL as well as DFU, SST, Q shell, DBU, you name it. Most of the time it's the acronyms that are the most powerful functions in the operating system, and we can track a user moving around and what they do in those environments. If the user is issuing a request from a PC, maybe from an Excel spreadsheet or an Access database or Crystal reports, then those access requests typically are going to come in as ODBC requests, and they're going to come through one of those exit points that I mentioned. And having an exit program that will audit those types of connections is critical to give you visibility to those things. So there's really a two-part answer. On the network side, we want to have exit programs to audit and control those requests. On the native side, we want to make sure that we're doing some type of screen capture so that we have visibility into those users operating on the green screen. All right, thanks for that question. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here. And it looks like 55% of you think that the IBM I server is at risk. So I'm glad, because the server really is at risk. And it's not because of any inherent weakness in the operating system. It comes down to the fact that we simply aren't configuring the security controls. I would argue with anybody that if you configure IBM I correctly, this is one of the most secure-able servers on the planet. There are some amazing features built into the operating system and even down in the hardware layer that make this thing virtually impenetrable. But It doesn't come that way from the factory. You have to turn those things on. You have to configure them. And so recognizing that the IBM server is at risk is a statement about the fact that most of us know that the operating system and the applications have not been secured correctly. Looks like 59% of you have said you do need to improve security, so I appreciate you coming here and listening. We do these events typically on a monthly basis, but there is a number of recorded webinars on the website, and like I said, I do speak at Common and other user groups, so if you have an opportunity to attend those types of events, certainly take some time, come to the security sessions that we host, and we would love to educate you on the IBM I operating system controls, as well as, of course, introduce you into some of the valuable features that the product solutions have as well. All right, well, that's the end of my content. I think that's the end of the questions as well. If you do have anything else, feel free to just quick post it in the chat window. I will hang out for a minute or two longer, but otherwise, again, I thank you for visiting, and we will send out that follow-up email, so bear with me. We'll get you a copy of the presentation and the recording. Until then, happy holidays, everybody. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you again in the new year.